The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across Birchwood Avenue as a weathered red pickup rolled down the lane, steady and slow. Behind the wheel sat an elderly black man, gray beard, dark skin, soft flannel shirt buttoned all the way up, and a sun-faded cap pulled low over steady eyes. His name was Solomon Hayes. He wasn't in a rush, nor did he need to be. But for Officer Kevin Chen, trailing behind in a police cruiser, the man's pace alone was reason enough to act. Chen watched him like a hawk. To him, that old truck didn't belong in this part of town, too rusty, too slow, too quiet. He flipped on his lights and siren. The truck complied instantly, pulling over with practiced ease. No sudden moves, no hesitation. Chen stepped out, adjusting his belt with the confidence of someone used to being in control. "License, registration, insurance," he snapped. Solomon nodded calmly. "Yes, sir," he said, voice low and even. His movements were deliberate, not sluggish, but careful, like a man who knew all too well what could go wrong when he moved too quickly. Chen didn't thank him. He just stared. "Where you headed?" he asked. "Home." "You always drive this slow?" "I drive safe." The tone was respectful but firm, enough to make Chen narrow his eyes. "Step out of the vehicle." Solomon glanced at him, quiet for a beat, then nodded again. "As you wish, officer." He stepped out with the patience of a man who had been through this before. Taller than expected, unthreatening, but composed. Still, Chen didn't see composure, he saw defiance. "Hands where I can see them." Solomon complied. Chen wasn't looking for a crime. He was looking for control. And in the stillness of that street, it was already slipping from him, though he hadn't realized it yet. Solomon stood beside his truck, hands calmly raised, eyes steady beneath the brim of his cap. Officer Chen circled him slowly, fingers twitching at his utility belt, searching for something he couldn't quite name, or maybe something he hoped to provoke. "You from around here?" Chen asked, voice tight. "I live just a few blocks north," Solomon replied. Chen glanced at the license again. The address matched, but something in him resisted moving on. "You work?" he asked next. "Yes." "What kind of work?" "Consulting," Solomon said, with that same quiet composure. Chen scoffed, just barely. "Consulting. Huh, interesting." He wasn't asking questions anymore. He was digging not for facts, but for friction. Something about the man's stillness unsettled him. The lack of fear, the lack of scrambling, it didn't fit the script. "You in a hurry to get home?" Chen asked, stepping in closer. "No, sir," Solomon answered. "Just on my way." "And you weren't trying to avoid me?" "I didn't even see you," Solomon said simply, "but I stopped the moment I did." Chen didn't like the way that sounded factual, but edged in dignity. It left no room for accusation, no excuse to escalate. Yet still, he felt it, that gnawing urge to press. He circled toward the truck bed, peered inside, then back at Solomon. "Open it." "There's nothing in there but a tarp and some tools," Solomon replied, his voice still even. "I said open it." Without a word, Solomon complied. The tailgate thudded open, revealing exactly what he had described. No surprises, no threats. Chen stared into the emptiness, jaw tight, then slammed it shut, harder than necessary. "You've got answers for everything, don't you?" he muttered. "I try to be clear," Solomon said, not unkindly. Chen stepped closer, face set. "You think you're clever? You think being calm makes you innocent?" Solomon held his gaze, unblinking. "I think being calm keeps things from becoming what they shouldn't." That landed hard. Chen straightened. His hand drifted closer to his belt again, not out of danger but out of discomfort. Something was happening here. The control he thought he had was unraveling. Not because Solomon fought back, but because he refused to lower himself. And Chen didn't know what to do with that. The silence between them hung heavy. Officer Chen wasn't done, not with the stop, and certainly not with Solomon. He needed to win something here, to reassert control, to prove that the badge still meant authority, and if he couldn't find a reason to write a ticket, He'd find another way to make his presence felt. "Turn around," Chen ordered. Solomon turned slowly, placing his hands on the hood of the truck. His motions were measured, calm, not submissive, just familiar. Like he'd done this before, like he expected it. Chen moved behind him, beginning the search. A rough pat-down. Arms, back, legs, no contraband, no weapons. Just the quiet confirmation that the old man wasn't a threat and never had been. "Empty your pockets," Chen barked. Solomon complied. Keys, a folded handkerchief, a pen. Nothing more. Chen stepped closer. "Open your mouth." There was a pause, long enough for the absurdity to settle. Solomon slowly turned his head. "Pardon?" "You heard me." For a second, Chen expected pushback. A glare, at least. But Solomon did exactly what was asked. He opened his mouth, wide and wordless, with a look that wasn't anger, just something heavier. Something tired. Chen leaned in, knowing full well he wouldn't find anything. This wasn't about suspicion, it was about message. And the message was clear. "I have power, you don't." But Solomon still didn't flinch. "You always this cooperative?" Chen muttered. "I try to survive," Solomon answered, evenly. The words made Chen pause, not because they were confrontational, but because they weren't. They held no accusation, no defiance. Just truth. "You got a lot of nerve, acting like you've got nothing to hide," Chen said. "I have nothing to hide," Solomon replied. His voice didn't rise, his body didn't shift, he didn't challenge Chen. But somehow, standing there with empty pockets and a mouth searched like contraband, he had never seemed more in control. And Chen? He had never felt smaller. Because despite everything he'd done, all the orders, all the commands, the man in front of him never lost his dignity. And Chen had no idea what to do with that. Chen took a step back, his boots scuffing against the asphalt. He stared at Solomon Hayes, the old man still standing beside his truck, his flannel shirt wrinkled from being searched, his pockets turned inside out, and his dignity untouched. None of it made sense. No argument, no anger, just this quiet resistance, so steady it was almost unbearable. "You always this calm?" Chen muttered. "I try to be," Solomon said simply. "You make a habit of getting pulled over?" "I make a habit of staying alive." Chen scoffed, but it rang hollow. He felt the heat rising in his chest, not from Solomon, but from himself, from the realization that every attempt to humiliate this man had failed. And worse, that the man knew it would fail before Chen had even started. "You think you're clever," Chen said. "Think you've got something on me." "I don't need anything on you, son," Solomon replied. "You showed me everything I needed the moment you walked up to my window." Chen bristled. "Watch your tone." "I've been watching yours since the minute you got here." Solomon's voice had shifted slightly, not louder, not angrier, but heavier. Like the weight of the moment had finally settled, and he was no longer interested in protecting Chen's comfort. "You didn't pull me over for a broken law," Solomon continued. "You pulled me over because you saw someone who didn't fit." Chen's lips parted, but no excuse came. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. "I've been followed home before," Solomon said. "I've been stopped on sidewalks, in stores, even in my own driveway, but this is the first time I've been stopped by someone who doesn't even realize what he's doing." Chen's face reddened. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Solomon replied. "I know that you've confused authority with value, that you think the badge gives you the right to decide who deserves respect." A beat of silence followed. Then Solomon reached into his back pocket slowly, carefully, his eyes locked on Chen the whole time. "Don't move," Chen said sharply, hand drifting toward his holster. "I'm reaching for my wallet," Solomon said evenly. "Just my wallet." He pulled it out with 2 fingers and opened it. Inside was a badge. Not his driver's license. Not an ID. A badge. Chen stared at it, unblinking. "Internal Affairs, Regional Director, Sacramento Division." His mouth went dry, his throat closed. Solomon held it up calmly. "My name is Solomon Hayes," I oversee officer conduct for this region." The silence between them shattered into something sharp and irreversible. "Your internal affairs?" Chen asked, barely above a whisper. "Yes. No one told me." "I'm not required to inform you during a stop," Solomon said. "But you've made this far more than a stop." Chen looked like he might be sick. Solomon continued, his voice never rising. "You've conducted an illegal search, verbal intimidation, and unnecessary escalation, all while failing to identify any violation of the law." "I didn't know." "And that," Solomon cut in, "is the most dangerous part. You didn't know. Because you didn't ask. Because the moment you saw me, you stopped listening." Chen stepped back, stumbling slightly. His eyes fell to the pavement. Solomon tucked the wallet away. "I didn't stop you today to test you," he said. "But when I realized what kind of man you were trying to be, I decided not to intervene. I wanted to see who you are when no one's watching." Chen's voice cracked. "Am I going to be reported?" Solomon looked at him for a long moment. Then said quietly, "You already are." The words weren't a threat, they were a fact. "But whether that report ends your career," he added, "depends on whether this moment ends your denial." Chen stared at him, shame thick in his expression. "Why didn't you stop me sooner?" "Because sometimes," Solomon said, "you don't teach by speaking, you teach by letting the consequences speak for you." He turned to walk back toward the truck. The sky above them had begun to darken, the horizon glowing with the last light of the day. Solomon opened the driver's door, paused, and looked over his shoulder one last time. "I don't need an apology," he said. "But if you ever wear that badge tomorrow, wear it for the right reason." Then he got in, started the engine, and drove off slowly without flashing lights, without urgency, without fear. Officer Chen remained frozen on the sidewalk, badge still pinned to his chest, but for the first time unsure if he deserved it. And in that stillness, a reckoning began. Officer Kevin Chen didn't move for a long time. The street was quiet now, the only sound the low rumble of Solomon's truck disappearing down the hill. The flashing lights on his cruiser still spun faintly, though the moment for authority had long passed. He slowly walked back to the driver's seat, sat down, and stared through the windshield. What just happened didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a mirror. He rewound the body cam footage on the small dashboard screen, rewatching himself, the sharp tone, the posturing, the search. His voice sounded different now, arrogant, mechanical, empty. And Solomon hadn't once raised his voice, hadn't resisted, hadn't even flinched. But Chen had looked at that man calm, respectful, unarmed, and decided he was a problem. And worse, he didn't even realize why. He played the part of a cop. Solomon had made him confront what kind of man he was. Later that night, Chen didn't sleep. He couldn't. The image of the badge internal affairs flashed again and again in his head, not because of fear, but because of what it revealed. Chen had always told himself he was one of the good ones. But now he saw the truth. A good officer doesn't need someone to be important to treat them with respect. And today, he hadn't seen a human being. He'd seen a stereotype. And that made all the difference. The next morning, Chen stood outside the Internal Affairs office, file in hand, not because he'd been summoned, because he chose to be there. Solomon's door opened quietly. Chen didn't speak right away. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just needed to face the man I tried to ignore." Solomon didn't invite him in. He simply nodded once. Acknowledgement, nothing more, nothing less. Chen turned to leave. But as he walked away, something shifted. He didn't feel exonerated. He felt accountable. And for the first time in his career, that felt right. The complaint didn't arrive in Solomon Hayes' office through an angry phone call or a viral video. It came the way most reckonings do, quietly. Filed formally, factually, accompanied by a body cam recording and a signed self-report from Officer Kevin Chen himself. It was the first time in Solomon's career that an officer had voluntarily documented his own misconduct before a civilian ever had the chance. Solomon read the statement twice. Not to verify its truth, he had already lived it, but to study the tone. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't performative. It was honest. Still, honesty didn't erase accountability. And Solomon had a job to do. Within the week, Chen's case was reviewed by an internal oversight panel. Not just because of Solomon's title, but because of the implications. If an officer could treat a high-ranking official with such disregard, what had he done to those without a badge of their own? Chen was suspended for 5 weeks without pay, a decision reached without appeal. But Solomon didn't stop there. He recommended Chen be enrolled in the department's new restorative conduct program, a pilot initiative that combined civilian feedback, reflection training, and community listening sessions. Not as a shortcut around discipline, but as a deeper kind of consequence. Punishment isn't the same as progress, Solomon told the board. If we don't change the way we rebuild trust, we're just sanding over rot. They listened. And this time, they agreed. For Chen, the suspension wasn't about time off. It was time inward. He spent the days reviewing past body cam footage, attending community forums, and speaking not as a cop, but as a listener. At one session, an elderly black man looked him in the eye and said, "You wear a badge, but do you carry a conscience?" Chen didn't answer. He just nodded. Because some lessons aren't meant to be replied to, only absorbed. By the end of the month, Solomon submitted a full report on Chen's misconduct, his voluntary admission, and the path forward. It ended with a single line. This officer failed a moment but chose not to fail himself. It wasn't absolution. It was truth. And in a system built on denial, truth was the most radical thing Solomon could write. Change didn't arrive with fanfare. There were no speeches, no press conferences, no headlines. But something had begun to shift inside the Sacramento Police Department, a quiet recalibration, not driven by policy, but by reflection. It started with whispers, officers asking about the new restorative conduct program, not mockingly, but curiously. A few even requested to sit in on community forums, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to hear what they'd never been taught to listen to. Some rolled their eyes. Others leaned in. At roll call, Chen spoke once briefly about what he'd been through. He didn't dramatize it, didn't excuse it. He just told the truth. "I thought the badge gave me authority," he said. "Turns out, it gives me responsibility I wasn't ready for." No one applauded, but no one laughed either. A few officers approached him afterward not to criticize, but to ask questions. How'd you know it was time to change? What was it like, facing someone you wronged? What did it feel like when you realized? Chen answered every question, and didn't dodge a single one. Solomon saw the ripple from his office, not in memos, but in behavior. Fewer escalations in discretionary stops. More restraint in field reports. And an uptick in officers requesting ride-alongs with community liaisons, something unheard of just a year earlier. No, it wasn't a revolution. But it was a shift. One born not of fear, but of awakening. And in a department where silence once covered mistakes, now there was something else beginning to take root. Accountability. Not enforced, but chosen. The evening was warm, the kind of soft Sacramento night that wrapped around the city without a breeze. Inside a modest community hall, chairs were arranged in a loose circle, no podium, no uniforms. No ranks. Just people. Officers sat beside residents. Gray-haired grandmothers beside young patrol rookies. No scripts, just stories. At the edge of the room, Solomon Hayes watched it unfold not as an official, but as a witness. The shift he had worked toward wasn't just structural, it was personal. Measured not in policies but in posture, in pauses, in the questions officers now asked before raising their voice or their hand. Kevin Chen sat quietly, listening to a young black student describe what it felt like to be stopped on his walk home. Chen didn't interrupt, he didn't defend. He just nodded. When the student finished, Chen spoke softly. "I can't undo what others have done to you, but I can promise it won't be me again." It wasn't redemption. It was responsibility. And in that small exchange, in that quiet, steady voice, Solomon saw the thing he had always fought for.